Linklater hanging and hit, plus the foul.
Michael, welcome. It's a real honor and a privilege to be able to chat with you today. And I wanted to start with land acknowledgement. I wish to acknowledge the land upon which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it's been the home to the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit, and is still home to many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island. And with this land acknowledgement, I also encourage all those who are watching and listening to reflect on Canada's history and the violence that was done onto Indigenous peoples who were here before the settlers, to tirelessly seek truth and to strenuously be proactive in reconciliation. So you must hear a lot of land acknowledgements. What do you feel when you hear a land acknowledgement?
The first time I heard a land acknowledgement, I was a little bit taken back because I had always been made to feel like I didn't belong. And so hearing that the land was being acknowledged, it was something that made me feel proud because it was like we were no longer being hidden. And so now we hear it quite often. And, you know, it's an opportunity for people who are giving the land acknowledgements to do a bit of self-reflection into why they're doing it. And I think it can be scary for some, which is why they may just revert to just reading verbatim. But I mean, anybody can read verbatim from anything that's put in front of them. So, you know, I would encourage people that are gifted the opportunity to share land acknowledgements that they, you know, make it, you know, a little more intimate and authentic to themselves.
Yeah, it's always struck me as an opportunity, as you say, to reflect, right? That it's actually, in many ways, an invitation for a conversation, right?
I agree that it should be the start of a conversation.
So I'm going to take you back to 2019, and I'm going to assume you're a Toronto Raptors fan, but of course, 2019, as you know, was an amazing year for Toronto Raptors basketball, winning the NBA championship. But it was also the year you and the Saskatchewan Rattlers won the inaugural CEBL championship, right?
Yep.
And in the final game, you defeated Hamilton, and you also announced your retirement. Take us back to that moment. I mean, very few of us, certainly not me, have ever experienced what must have been an incredible moment for your career, for the love of basketball, and for the achievements that the team was able to make.
So when I knew the league was going to be, you know, coming into inception and that Saskatoon was going to have a team, it was an opportunity for me to play and play out. And I knew I was in the latter part of my career where I wasn't looking to continue pushing any further.
Right.
You know, I was very, very satisfied. And so when the coach and general manager, Greg Jochums, reached out and asked if I was interested in playing, from a personal standpoint in terms of furthering my career, I had no aspirations. But from an ending of my career, to be able to have the opportunity to play in front of my friends and family, but most importantly, to be able to help or inspire any young Indigenous players or athletes or people, youth, attending those games, to see somebody that looked like them on the floor was really the reason why I wanted to play.
On tonight's game, it will be the end of an era for Saskatchewan celebrated basketball player Michael Linklater.
I've been in championship games before. I'm going to utilize my experience and leadership to help the guys as best as I can to get this win.
Saskatoon. The Rattlers have been embraced in Saskatoon in more ways than one. Down to 30 to go.
I'm just grateful for every moment. And that's really what you got to take from this, enjoying every second of it, because for me this is going to be the last 40 minutes of my career.
Saskatchewan Rattlers are the champions.
Those moments, you're filled with gratitude.
Yeah.
And grateful for all of the people and sacrifice that it takes to get there.
Yeah.
So very surreal moment, like textbook story, fairy tale ending for me in my career, to be able to finish it off at home, inaugural season, winning the championship, and then retiring.
And then retiring all in the same night.
It was great.
What kind of impact do you think that had on Indigenous youth? To see you hoist the championship, to see you enjoy that bittersweet moment. I mean, you must see it as an honor and a privilege, but it must also be, it must also feel like a responsibility, right? Because again, we often hear it's one thing to be the first one or one of the first ones, but it's another thing to be the only one or one of the very few.
I think the first time I got asked to speak to, in front of an audience, to my peers, I was 16 years old.
Wow. And
so I was, I guess, tasked with the responsibility of being a role model. It wasn't something I had asked for. But it's something I took very seriously. And I do feel the responsibility. And I wouldn't call it a pressure. There's not pressure to do some of the things that I'm doing. But there's a responsibility for me in terms of respecting and honoring my ancestors who were here before me and what they went through in order for me to be here today.
You've been a tireless advocate for the calls to action embedded in the Truth and Reconciliation process here in Canada. And you've spoken before about the importance of truth. And I referenced it as well in the land acknowledgement I gave, because that struck me as something almost feels like a never-ending pursuit of truth, right? In your estimation, how do you feel that Canadian society is doing with respect to the truth part of the calls to action?
Truth is extremely important. Yeah. When we look at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, there was, I believe it was around 6 years in order to get all of the stories of over 6,000 residential school survivors. And, what was brought forth on that was all of those truths being uncovered. And so everything that's been brought out from those calls to action, it really does start with truth, even as individuals. Right. When corporate Canada is being called out, when the government's being called, to answer calls, it's important for
universities
us,
too.
Every different, setting. It's important for us as individuals. That's where we need to look as individuals. What is our truth? And looking at our own shortcomings. I think we have to look at our own biases. Yeah. And when we do that personal inventory, then we're able to start moving forward. Because if we even relate it back to basketball, as a player on a team, I have my responsibility. Yeah. And as a collective, we move forward to attain a championship. So as society, we have our roles as individuals, because it's not one person running any of these organizations. Right. It's a collective. Yeah. So if you have a collective that has uncovered their own truths and biases about the history of Canada and the atrocities towards Indigenous peoples, once you uncover those truths, you can start to move forward. And once we have a collective moving forward, it becomes that much more powerful.
Powerful, yeah. I'm struck sometimes by how monumental of a task it is, in the sense that, what does successful reconciliation look like? I mean, one way of thinking about reconciliation is to say, now we're reconciled. And yet it seems to me that it puts too fine of an end to what ought to be a process that is ongoing. I don't know how you think about it. Is there ever a we are now reconciled?
So there's two parts to this. The struggle with Canada and reconciliation is that the genocide is ongoing right now.
Right.
So there hasn't been an end.
There hasn't been an end here.
So right now, when you look at the child welfare system, there are more Indigenous children in care right now than at the height of the residential school system.
Yeah.
Our children make up roughly 50% of children in care. So what difference is the residential school system?
Right.
What we say, what I've heard our elders say, is that it's just transferred to this. The second part to that is when we talk about reconciliation, how we could be completely reconciled is for the treaties to be upheld.
Yeah.
When you actually look at that legally binding agreement, the treaties, a nation-to-nation relationship, that has never been met. So the federal government creating the Indian Act still undermines treaty. So if we actually went back to treaty and what the original intent and purpose of it was, then we would have all of the resources that we once had in terms of the abundance to be able to heal ourselves. But now we're still under the foot of the Indian Act and the federal government that continues to oppress Indigenous peoples. And for that, how can we really be reconciled when the Indian Act still undermines treaty? So we are doing our part as a collective, and we're doing what we can, but our leaders of our nations are still advocating for treaty rights that, again, every Canadian benefits from.
Wab main gan na sigasan aba kaptibo ostinya absis ne hewen muchos ko ne hewan maga kitea exkanamo check ne hewan kapik squay win nista akamema. My name is Michael Linklater, but my given name is White Wolf, and I'm from Thunderchild First Nation, which is a part of Treaty 6 territory.
He has spent much of his life being told all the reasons he couldn't make it as a basketball player. He was the wrong age, the wrong size, even the wrong color.
Of course, I dealt with my fair share of racism growing up and being teased for having long hair, even on the basketball court, and even having it pulled.
And while those voices may have extinguished the internal fire in lesser people, they only served to stoke it for Linklater.
A couple of summers ago, we saw the world seized by the resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement. And in many regards, we saw the WNBA first and the NBA really at the vanguard of that. What is your thinking when you see this?
So I think it's important to note that those Black Lives Matter, the movement, Black people, those are our relatives. So when we see anyone else who is struggling, we take it upon ourselves to make sure that we are supporting their movement. So I think that movement is something that is a responsibility for all of us to make sure that we continue to advocate and support.
I mean, when I think back over recent memory, some of the most impactful political moments have taken place on the basketball court or on the football field. I'm thinking about Black Lives Matter shirts that the players wore. I'm thinking about the basketball players who didn't play. I'm thinking about Colin Kaepernick taking the knee. These are these moments have been more impactful than any stump speech any politician, or at least in my recollection anyway. Maybe I should pay more attention to those stump speeches, but those seem to me to have been more impactful than any other political event.
What colonization has done a great job at is creating division amongst us as people of color.
Yeah.
Because now we're too busy fighting amongst each other
Right.
and not necessarily supporting one another.
Right. Right.
So through a lot of the marches, our people were there out in droves, singing their songs, supporting one another.
Yeah.
So it was really important, for us to make sure that we were there as allies.
Yeah.
Because for any of those who are familiar, with the War of 1812,
Mm-hmm.
again, it was Indigenous people supporting
Yeah.
as allies.
Yeah.
So again, now that we've come this far and where we're at today and how much Indigenous people are affected, we need allies to support us.
In the calls to action, there are several calls, I think 5 to be exact, that are related to sports specifically.
So I believe call to action number 88 talks about the North American Indigenous Games.
Mm-hmm.
And I was very fortunate to be able to participate in the North American Indigenous Games as a youth. And what it did for me was, one, I was able to feel comfortable competing with peers, people who looked like me. But the second thing was, it was this enormous event, an international multi-sport games.
Yeah.
For me, as just a young Cree kid from Thunderchild growing up in the streets of Saskatoon.
Yeah.
It let me believe that I belonged in settings like that,
Yeah.
regardless of color.